So hello, Inga, you can hear us? Can you hear us, Inga? Yeah, good, very good. So let's start. So our next paper, as you've seen, is going to be on Zoom, and it will be delivered by Inga Behrendt. Now, Inga did her doctorate at the Universität für Musik und Darstellende Kunst Graz on the Liber Ordinarius Schule für Kirchenmusik der Diözese Rothenburg-Stuttgart, where she also teaches music history and ecclesiastical Latin. Since October 2024, she also holds a lectureship in Gregorian chant at the Pontificio Istituto di Musica Sacra in Rome. Now, the paper today the work for it was done in collaboration with two Sardinians, Francesco De Fenu and Pier Paolo Canu, and they are both studying at the Pontificio Istituto di Musica Sacra in Rome, pursuing a licentiate in Gregorian chant. Unfortunately, they had to cancel being present to give the paper due to illness. So we are looking forward, Inga, and we hope this all works technologically speaking. And I'm not sure how the questions are going to work at the end, but we'll sort that out at that point. Thank you, Inga.
Good morning. Thank you very much for this kind introduction. I immediately would like to say that my two students unfortunately cannot be here. They would like to say greetings. They are ill. I'm sorry for this. Observations on new notation in St. Gall, 10th and 11th centuries, with a view to manuscripts from Minden and Regensburg. My first question is, do I am hearable? Is everything easy to listen to? Is the technique working, please? If somebody
we can hear you, Inga.
Thank you very much. The manuscript, St. Gall manuscript group is one of the world's largest collections from the 10th and 12th centuries that has been preserved from a scriptorium. The transmission of neumes from St. Gall codices from this period is consistent across the codices, but not entirely identical. Why is this the case, and what impact does this fact have on the interpretation of neumes? Several studies have described the high informative value of the neumes in the early St. Gall manuscripts, notably the Cantatorium 359, the Gradualia 342 and 339. In contrast, the informative value of the neume notation in the Codex 375 from 1135 has greatly diminished. This raises the question of whether the manuscripts from the intervening period, those from the late 11th century, still retain or have already lost some of the great informative values of the early neumes. This concerns manuscripts from the period between approximately 925 and 1075. Are changes in neume notation compared to earlier traditions an expression of a particular interpretation of melody and text, what Franz Karl Prassel calls scriptor interpres? And if so, when and where in the chants do the neumes in these late 11th century manuscripts actually reveal the neume writer's expressive intent? And how can this be proven? Which neume symbols have been changed over the decades without the interpretation gaining any additional meaning? Is there any evidence, for example, for a standardized notation of neumes, e.g. in melodic formulas? Do writing habits, also carelessness in writing, need to be taken into account? And in which melodic passages? How do the manuscripts differ in this respect? The question of re-evaluating the St. Gall manuscripts from the 11th century is widely discussed in specialist literature. Prassel argues that the later manuscripts should also become a source of interpretative inspiration. 2018. This contrasts with the previous opinion that these 11th century manuscripts should rather be seen as evidence of the beginning decline of any authentic theory of interpretation, 2025, Johannes Beckman's Göschel. Johannes Beckman's Göschel, in particular, repeatedly emphasizes that the Codices 359, Einsiedeln 121, and Law 239 enjoy the highest authority as reference manuscripts. Antonina Kalechitz evokes the idea of the scriptor interprets of the 11th century Codices in a dissertation. You see a quotation there, and she says, the most promising approach to this lies in the comparative analysis of the articulation markings within a manuscript family in order to bring to light concrete, verifiable clues about legato definition, egoic dynamics, or vocal technic solutions. Her collations of the neumes in the St. Gall manuscripts of Kalechitz were used in this work. I also used my own collations and as well the ones of Kirsten Trudeau, a student of the PIMS in Rome. Besides the manuscripts of St. Gall, you see in the field above, I used the 211th manuscripts from Minden, you see below, and also the Bamberg Lit 6 manuscript. In the meta, I used the illustrations from the Graduale Novum. And here is one of my collations. First, a few basic observations. The collations show that the songs have the same melody in the manuscripts consulted. The grouping of neumes remains largely the same in the melismas. This also applies to the 2 Minden manuscripts and the one from Ratisbona, Lit 6. So I hope it's visible well. The transcription. In manuscripts from the period after 1020, it is often difficult to determine whether an epithema is noted for individual neumes or not. While manuscripts from before 1000 are very or more clear in this regard, this is hardly ever the case in manuscripts from after 1020. We have here in front of us one example. In Graduale 374, some epithemas cannot be clearly identified. It's shown with arcs in yellow, where the epithema is not very, very good visible. And with an arrow in blue, we see it's very easily to be seen. Also difficult to differentiate is often the climacus subipunctis to a climacus with tractuli. We find here an example in the famous Introito Radiceli. At the second slide, very low is a section from Ratisbona, Bamberg, Regensburg, and you see the manuscript. Please see that on the right, Scandicus subpunctis, I would assume to tractuli. On the left, it's difficult to see. So in this regard, the collationes have the same problems as the original manuscript, right? Antonina Kalechitz writes in her dissertation that there are more single nude neumes with epithema and tenete in the more recent manuscripts, the 11th century manuscripts. These are found pretonic, proclitic, posttonic, and at the end of words, as Kalechitz has shown in individual studies in her work. You see here the Graduale Audifilia et Vide, and the manuscripts, the lower ones give the 11th century manuscripts 374, 339, 340, and 376. In the beginning, they have tractuli, sometimes with epithema, sometimes without. However, she sees the fact that not all single neumes in the younger manuscripts are accompanied by epithema attenuate as an argument against mechanically copying these neumes. In her view, the addition is already linked to a specific execution, a multi-valued execution of some kind. At this point, I would like to refer to a quote from Agostoni Göschel. While the oldest Sangal manuscripts, such as Cantatorium 359 in particular, usually refrain from explicitly indicating syllable articulation in current neumes, as it could be assumed that the text would be performed correctly. In the younger manuscripts of the Sangal notation family from the 11th century, it becomes almost the rule from which it can be concluded that at that time the understanding of the intimate connection between word and sound in Gregorian chant was increasingly being lost. What Göschel addresses here is distinguished in literature by the terms normative and descriptive. Stefan Engels. All are neumes descriptive. In other words, do they describe precisely the moments of articulation that are to be performed when singing? Are all details indicated, even the small elongations that arise unconsciously with the natural flow of speech? Or are the neumes normative? Does the neume writer assume that the living singing tradition is bound to the structure of the language, that word accents and word boundaries are clearly indicated, so that only the peculiarities of the rhythmic structure need to be indicated in the neume notation? As an example of this normative notation in adiastemmatic neumes, we show the beginning of the introit gaudete. In the first word, gaudete, as in the word domino, the melody and neumatic notation creates a risk that the word accent cannot be heard. You see it a bit bigger in the manuscripts above from the 11th century. If the main accent is not articulated, this word gaudete results in an incorrect accent in the Latin language. Gaudete. And also Domino semper. In this moment, the younger manuscripts are clarifying, and they use attenuate. I don't see whether you see my mouse, but it's here, the attenuate. And they also use an epithema at the end of the salicus, domino. We can see the same in the manuscripts from Minden and also Ratisbona. Tractuli con epithema e un salicus, un altro salicus con epithema. Other observations. We find in the manuscript 338 also single neumes that single syllables that have only their punctum isolated above a syllable, something that is in the literature written only for 342 and also for 359, the manuscripts before 1000, but we also find it in 338. The Minden manuscript, of course, has a lot of verses so every manuscript has its own peculiarities. When we look to the collation of Atelevavi, we find here in the section in Te Confido some manuscripts that give the epithema and others not. And the problem is now, or the case is now, the observation is now, that it's not the rule that the manuscripts from the 11th century write an epithema and want somehow a different execution than manuscripts from before 1000. Other situations are here. when you are in the beginning of a phrase, and some manuscripts give the pes quadratus, others not. And it's not the case that only this happens in the manuscripts from below or after 1000. We also see that the rules how to use and when to use tractulus and virga are observed differently. This changes in the manuscripts. It's not as strictly the same, and the rules are obviously not taken always into account in all the manuscripts. Some clear with epizema, some do not write an epizema. So it's not as easy to find the reason why they use the neum and the alloneum. Also, we see that within a melisma, the structure is not always the same. In this particular communio of the Fourth Advent, we see that most of the manuscripts do use the epizema or the longer values for the middle tones, but not all of them. We have also others that use a salicus flexus. And there is also the case of quilisma con 2 hooks in 374. I found it at a lot of places. It's not only in 359 and 342. The same case here. Sometimes un torculus specialis is indicated, sometimes not. We know this already also from the early manuscripts, but now it can be seen at one glance in a collation. See, thank you very much for your attention.
Going to handle these questions. So people can speak from the room and yeah. So maybe if somebody wants to ask a question, they should come to the, or they can get the microphone. Okay, right. Thank you, Inga. Very interesting to hear more about St. Gallen. Questions? Well, I can start. Can I start? I should speak from here? Yeah. Inga, I confess I'm not completely up to date with the writings. Sorry, can you hear this?
Yes.
There's been so much writing about St. Gallen notation by a whole semiological school, and the rest of us don't always know all about it. But there's, I mean, a kind of starting point is, to what extent do you think there was, I mean, I'm not sure coming out of your examples whether you're arguing for a continuous sameness of a way of performing, or actually there being developing differences in this central St. Gallen situation, which is being transferred to Minden and perhaps to Regensburg. But
thank you very much for your question. In this moment, I'm not so quick as others. I would rather like to really examine the introits through all the Lenten time, and also, if possible, if I because I have the feeling, but it's in the moment a feeling that I really need to assure that some manuscripts do really share information of a scriptor interface, and others only show habits. So but in the moment, I'm not so much gaining for a new information about the performance, but more of the peculiarities of the manuscripts. 374 uses the quilisma with 2 hooks, seems to be really the tonal and not the semitonal. This is interesting for me. When in the 11th century manuscripts, the sign changes, I would like to explicitly know which manuscript does it. So is there, for example, the habit in 376 not to show the torculus specialis, but the normal torculus? Is this more the case than in 338? These questions, I think, need to be solved before we speak of any idea of interpretation. My opinion. Thank you very much.
What is the reason for concentrating on 11th century sources?
Yeah, I mean, we are now able to use all these manuscripts and make these collations. And the reason is we really would like to know the sviluppa, the development of the scriptorias. So is Minden independent, the second Minden manuscript, and in which moment depending? Is there really an idea of creating new informants, like Stefan Engels published about the South German manuscripts where the tractulus has different meanings than any rhythmical. So when does it happen and why does it happen, and how is the performance praxis? Where was the impulse to create a new notation? Why do they start to write the younger German, East Frankish notation? When is it? How is the connection of the scriptoria? I'm interested in these questions.
Of course, I mean, I'm sort of thinking, was the Minden manuscript written in Minden or in St. Gallen? Do we know?
Yeah, it's written in the commentary of your publication of 381 that Minden. Well, I don't know, but I'm only looking for the news. So there are other people, historians, that know more. That is my expertise. I only look for the news. So perhaps I'll find the same series, the same order of news in manuscripts and the same articulation points, what we call in the moment articulation, which we don't know for the 11th century.
Yeah. Questions? I mean, I can go on asking questions, but I don't want to dominate the question.
Please so.
Jeremy.
Question. I was interested in one of your examples with the punctum, with the littera significativa of a C. So a short pitch. So if I understand correctly, you would then have a punctum with a C, a punctum on its own, a tractulus, and a tractulus with an epicema. So what habits lay behind such distinctions, and how far were they crystallized in different attitudes to writing?
I think it's a good question. You mean the example 338, I think, where we have one syllable with a punctum and a ciliary tongue. I think it's a punctum. I think you can see it. Perhaps I should open it again. Perhaps it's visible here. This one, isn't it? Jeremy, is this an example? I'm sorry, is it possible to see my slide? I'm sorry, but when I get back to my presentation, I do not see anybody. So was it the correct slide? Sorry. Sorry, but can I please Do you hear me? Sorry.
Yeah, we can hear you, but we cannot see your PowerPoint presentation. So please
Okay, thank
send
you.
another
Tell me.
request for sharing
Yes.
your
Was this
screen.
the right slide? Is it visible now?
We cannot see your screen. I'm sorry, Inga.
Ah, that is strange because I did nothing different to before.
But can you
In
hear
the
us?
situation before. I just shared my slide.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, thank you very much. Thank you for the help. If somebody could comment a bit, it would be much easier. I'm sorry. The technique. Is this a correct slide? Are you referring to this? I'm sorry.
Yes, it is.
Cannot hear anything. Sorry.
It is the
Yes,
correct.
Yes, it is the correct slide.
Yeah.
Inga, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the question was whether this implicates a different education. So does punctum still have the meaning of being quick, or is it a tractulus together with a celerita? That was the question, isn't it?
Would seem to be, from the materials you presented, a very different way of singing individual pitches. And the question is that whether that reflects habits within performing communities, or how far that is part of a way of traditions of writing. And this is why the example is so interesting that you've presented.
Yeah, I agree totally. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Can I, even more simply, Jeremy, you'll permit me. I mean, does this C mean, because it's a punctum, not a tractulus, so is it saying sing this punctum really, really fast, or is it just emphasizing the fact of the punctum?
Yeah. This manuscript is also in the Pressus Major using a tractulus, with what you can see semi-nant at the end.
But Inga, we're talking about the very beginning where you've got the red arrow.
Yeah, I'm just trying to give another example how this manuscript is very detailed in punctum and tractulus. So there seems to be a clear punctum, and the question is, probably you shall sing it not only celerita, but perhaps even very light. I don't know. It is. We would like to know, but we don't. No, it's only another indication here. It should be sang quick. Perhaps it's also only a tradition of writing. I wouldn't be so quick in this moment because I rather would like to know all the material, but we observe this moment.
Are there other questions? No, I mean, Inga, I think I want to say thank you for being the person in this conference that talked about St. Gallen notation, because it belongs in the whole discussion. So thank you very much to you and
Thank you very much. I give also forward thank you to the contributors, Pier Paolo and Francesco Canu. Grazie.
Yes,
thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay. Now, I think we go on to the next paper. So, right, I'm supposed to do the introduction first. So, I'm going to fall back on the not introducing people at great length principle, because I hope Catherine is well known to many. I think I wanted to say that she's done the Oxford-Cambridge transfer twice. But the second time, I mean, she went to Oxford, Cambridge, and then she went back to Oxford, and then she went to Stony Brook, and then Oslo, and now she's come back to Cambridge, and we're very happy that she's back in Cambridge.
I need a... No, the first one, conferenza. I see, perfect. Yeah, perfect. Okay. Okay, can you hear me? Okay. Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Giovanni, and the whole SCRIBEMUS team for such a lovely conference. And my paper is slightly different because I am going to talk about transmission, but I'm doing it through the lens of, well, I would hesitate to call it a genre, but perhaps a particular musical corpus for a particular liturgical moment. So today I'm going to discuss written traces before 1100 of the liturgical versicle Benedicamus Domino, let us bless the Lord, and its answering response, Deo gratias, thanks be to God. And I'm sure you all know, but liturgically, the Benedicamus was sung as the closing or dismissal versicle at the end of all of the monastic offices except matins, and also at the end of Mass, replacing the Ite Missa Est in the penitential seasons of Advent and Lent. And the early history of transmission and elaboration of the Benedicamus versicle is of interest for two reasons. And the first is that the Benedicamus didn't have an established written tradition or any fixed place in a particular liturgical book before 1100. So the earliest traces of this little dismissal blessing are overwhelmingly informal, and they're as end leaf or marginal additions, and usually within non-liturgical books. And second, these examples that I'll talk about today, inscribed in the late 10th and in the 11th centuries, they often elaborate the Benedicamus versicle musically and textually, so they furnish it with additional poetic and prose texts. And it's these elaborations that are my focus today. So I'm not going to talk about the liturgical plain chant melodies that just set the words Benedicamus Domino and Deo gratias, but rather I'm only going to talk about the examples that we might call tropes or songs, which extend the liturgical texts Benedicamus Domino and Deo gratias with additional words. And previously, it hasn't been possible to get a sense of these Benedicamus elaborations and their circulation before 1100. So I've tried to define the corpus, and I've identified 18 manuscript sources across which 41 individual Benedicamus elaborations were inscribed before 1100. And so I've left out the sources that are like circa 1100. I'm kind of focusing on those that we can definitely say are probably 11th century, maybe late 10th. And 25 of these 41 Benedicamus elaborations are unique. So it's quite a unique corpus. I don't know if that's because there are lots of different elaborations or because we have very few surviving sources or a combination of both. So geographically, 10 of my 18 sources are in the distinctive Aquitanian notation, typical of southern France. 2 are from central France, one's from Cluny, one's from Autun, and 3 are from the north of France, and 2 are from England, and each has just one unique item. And then there's one source from southern Germany, and I'm sorry to say I don't have any Italian sources that are 11th century, but if you know any, please let me know. So there are only 2 11th century examples of what we could call collections of Benedicamus elaborations. The first is a group of 15 Benedicamus elaborations in an early 11th century troper proser from Aquitaine on the left. And the second is a collection of 10 Benedicamus in a pair of late 11th century fragments from Anchin in northern France. And I'm going to give a sense of how these Benedicamus elaborations work in these sources, and then of how and where they travelled or not. The early 11th century Aquitanian manuscript, the well-known Paris Latin 887, it has 15 elaborations of the Benedicamus Domino versicle grouped together, and all with answering elaborations for the Deo gratias response. So normally these are bipartite settings. They have a melody for the Benedicamus Domino part, and then you sing the same melody again for the Deo gratias part. And typically, the quoted liturgical texts of the versicle and the response are arranged symmetrically in both parts. And you've basically got 3 main options for how you arrange the text. So you can start each part with Benedicamus Domino and Deo gratias and then go on to elaborate. Or you can use the elaboration, the textual elaboration, to lead up to the Benedicamus Domino and the Deo Gratias exclamation, or you can use what you could call the sandwich form, which is you start with Benedicamus, you add new text in the middle, and you close with Domino, and then you do the same again for the response Deo Gratias. Now, as we all know, the sandwich form is very typical of prosody, pre-existing plain chant melismas to which syllabic trope texts were added. And although these prosula-like texts, the form of them, that's very prevalent in the Aquitanian collection in Latin 887, but I haven't been able to identify a plain chant source for any of these 15 Benedicamus. So I can't say securely that any of these pieces are true prosulae, and there's actually only one plain chant melody that was definitely used as the basis of Benedicamus prosulae before 1100. It's not present in this collection, but I'm going to come back to it at the end of the paper. And in fact, it's proved very difficult to identify concordances for Benedicamus melodies or texts in Latin 887. 10 of the 15 Benedicamus elaborations are unique to this collection. And for the 5 that I have been able to find elsewhere, the concordances are either in other Aquitanian books or in later 12th century collections from Tuscany. So it seems that the Benedicamus elaborations in Latin 887 mostly didn't travel, but when they did, they stayed within Aquitaine or they went south of the Alps to Italy. Now, there's just one piece in this Latin 887 collection that we also find in northern France, and it's Ea Puri Jubilo, the most widely copied early Benedicamus elaboration. Ea Puri Jubilo is also in the late 11th century fragments from Anchine, and it's the only item that's shared between these northern French fragments and the earlier Aquitanian collection. So it's just the one point of contact between our two 11th century collections. Now, exceptionally, Ea Puri Jubilo survives in a third 11th century source, and that makes it the only Benedicamus elaboration for which we have 3 written records pre-1100. And this third witness was listed by Michel Huglot, but it has subsequently been overlooked in scholarship. It's also from northern France, and it was added underneath another Benedicamus elaboration on an initial end leaf in a 9th century non-liturgical book from the Abbey of Saint-Bertin, so quite near Anchine in northern France. And in addition to the 3 11th century witnesses of Ea Puri Jubilo, we find it in multiple 12th century books from Norman Sicily, Italy, and southern Germany. But the only Aquitanian source I have for this Benedicamus remains Latin 887, and that's chronologically the earliest source of the piece. So you could think, okay, this is originally an Aquitanian piece that then went north, but it's also possible that Ea Puri Jubilo, and this is what Wolfalt thinks, that it originated in northern France and it had already travelled south by the early 11th century. The scribes of Latin 887 included it, but it's notably absent from later 12th century Aquitanian collections of Benedicamus elaborations, and we have quite a lot of those. So it seems that later Aquitanian singers and scribes no longer knew this piece, or they didn't care to record it. And this reflects what is more generally a perceptible separation of the repertoire of early Benedicamus elaborations in sources from northern and southern France. So as I mentioned, the majority of Benedicamus sources I have before 1100 are southern French. They're in Aquitanian notation, and they give an overall impression of particular traditions and compositions that are quite specific to this region. So most obviously, we have 3 Benedicamus elaborations dedicated to local Aquitanian saints. And among the 15 Benedicamus in Latin 887, we have this unique and substantial text for San Martial. And actually the only known 11th century examples of a Benedicamus elaboration prescribed within the context of a specific liturgical rite, these are within 2 office liturgies for Aquitanian saints. So there's a different and shorter Benedicamus for San Martial that's placed within at the end of Lauds within an office for San Martial that James Greer has identified as an autograph composition by Adhémar de Chabannes, created in 1028 or 1029 in Limoges. And Greer associates this rare liturgical prescription of a bespoke Benedicamus with Adhémar. So he thinks it's Adhémar who's creating this and it's kind of special practice. But in fact, these circumstances are matched by a unique Benedicamus for Sainte Foy that's placed at the end of Lauds in the office for her translation and was copied in a late 11th century liturgical booklet from the Abbey of Conques. So the unique status of these 3 Benedicamus elaborations for local Aquitanian saints typifies more generally the Aquitanian situation before 1100. Although I have the most surviving Benedicamus sources from this region before 1100, most of them transmit isolated Benedicamus elaborations that I can't find anywhere else. But I have succeeded in identifying new concordances for 3 early Aquitanian Benedicamus, and all of these concordances are within Aquitaine. So one is for Benedicamus Deo Vero, which Uglo identified as an addition made in the 10th or 11th century to a non-liturgical book that was once in the Abbey of Saint Martial in Limoges. And Benedicamus Deo Vero was apparently written at speed, and it has the prosiula-like sandwich form with new text between the words Benedicamus and Domino, and the same melody again with new text between Deo and Gratias. But I can't identify any quoted chant melody here. Benedicamus Deo Vero was added, you'll have noticed, underneath a melody for the Mass dismissal versicle, Ite missa est, and its response, which it shares with the Benedicamus, Deo Gratias. So this was a scribe who was thinking about melodies for the end of a ritual, and probably specifically for the end of the Mass. Now, Marie-Noël Colette didn't know this Saint Martial source of Benedicamus Deo Vero, but she found another 11th century trace of this piece, which was again added as quite a hasty-looking addition in a non-musical book. And this scribe was working in Albi, near Toulouse, and this time Benedicamus Deo Vero was paired not with melodies for the Ite missa est, the Mass dismissal, but with another Benedicamus elaboration, Ea nunc pueri. And the Albi editions, I think, suggest an interest in music, again for the end of a ritual, but it's for the ritual moment of the Benedicamus, which was most often sung in the office. And here, perhaps, as implied by the text, Ea nunc pueri, it was sung by boys. Now, there's no link to the Ite missa est dismissal in Albi, but the Benedicamus and Ite dismissal versicles are connected again in a mid-11th century troper from Apt, where we have Benedicamus chants with 2 elaborations interspersed, and they're immediately followed by Ite missa est chants, again with 2 elaborations of that versicle. And this Apt troper was studied by Gunilla Björkfall, and she thought that its 2 Benedicamus elaborations were unique. In fact, the first one is already in Latin 887, and the second one, Te preso oppido, which looks like, well, it's in a different colour of ink, it looks like it was added in slightly later, and they have to finish off the Deo Gratias here. Te preso oppido is, it survives in a slightly later source. It was added in the late 11th or in the 12th century alongside 2 other musical items with Aquitanian notation to this 9th century non-liturgical book owned by the cathedral chapter in Albi. It's now in Berlin. Te preso oppido doesn't actually quote the words of the Benedicamus Domino versicle, but it alludes to it through the verb forms benedicas and benedicendum. And the text is interesting because it addresses the bishop directly, asking him to bless his people, and then exhorting the clergy to respond with Deo Gratias. So overall, it seems that Aquitanian Benedicamus elaborations before 1100 stayed within this region. If they travelled further, it was usually south to Italy, but mostly they didn't have a wide dissemination, at least as far as the surviving sources we've been able to find. And we have a lot of unica, even though I have, relatively speaking, a lot of Aquitanian sources. So it seems that institutions in southern France, at Saint Martial, at Conques, at Moissac, at Albi, at Apt, and at Carcassonne, that they possibly preferred to create their own new and particular elaborations for the little Benedicamus versicle, just as they did for their own local saints, Saint Martial and Sainte Foy. The early situation in Aquitaine contrasts starkly with that in northern France, where there are many fewer unique Benedicamus elaborations. And unlike my highly unique Aquitanian collection, Latin 887, 7 of the 10 Benedicamus elaborations in the Ancien fragments have extant concordances. So I had 5 out of 15 for Aquitaine, and here I have 7 out of 10. And these 7 concordant pieces, I found them in at least 3 further sources beyond Ancient, and these further sources are normally, as we might expect, Norman Sicilian books, but also manuscripts from the German-speaking lands, and only very occasionally in books from Italy. And this picture of northern French items not really going south, but maybe going east, this picture is reinforced by my identification of a previously elusive text fragment in the Ancient fragments. And Wolf-Alt correctly hypothesized that this little text snippet was the end of an elaborated Deo Gratias response. And indeed, it belongs to Benedicamus Domino qui parvis in praesepio, which isn't in any inventories of Benedicamus elaborations because it otherwise survives only in the form of hitherto elusive ad hoc editions, which were all made probably in the 12th century, but on the end leaves of older books. So it was written down 3 times with Frankish notation in this book from Saint-Bertin that Giovanni kindly brought to my attention. And it was added in a mixed Frankish and Lotharingian notation on the end leaf of this book from the western Rhineland or eastern France, and that was in Trier in the 12th century. And it was also among musical editions in this book from Clermont in central France, where it wasn't provided with notation. Now, the text and music of Benedicamus Domino qui parvis in praesepio are unstable in all of its sources, and in the book from Saint-Bertin, the Deo Gratias part is omitted altogether. But comparing the 2 versions of the Deo Gratias ending with the snippet from Ancient, I think this collection in Ancient clearly contained this simple Christmas Benedicamus, and that fits with the liturgical ordering in the Ancient collection. And possibly this was a text that was sung or adapted to different melodies, as the different neumes that we have suggest. But it had a relatively wide and predominantly informal circulation, invariably north of Aquitaine and also further east towards the Rhine. So this possibility of early eastward travel for Benedicamus elaborations from northern France is borne out by the first witness we have to the Benedicamus versicle from the German-speaking lands, and it takes the form of an 11th century edition with southern German neumes to an older book of homilies. I'll show you the notation in more detail in a second, but this was a copy of Benedicamus Flori Orto, for which the Ancient fragments were previously our only known 11th century source. Now, Benedicamus Flori Orto is a true prosula. It adds syllabic text to the well-known Benedicamus plain chant melody that itself borrows a pre-existing melisma on the words Flos Filius Eius, taken from the responsory Stirps Jesse. And the prosula text sandwiched between Benedicamus and Domino, it borrows vocabulary directly from the original Stirps Jesse responsory source. It refers to flowers, flori, to the root of Jesse, Stirps Jesse, and it puns on the words virga stem and virgo virgin. Now, in my 11th century southern German source, the Flos Filius Eius melody was written out 4 times over 3 lines. So first we have the melody with the prosula text for the Benedicamus, but you see that Flori Orto is sandwiched between Benedicamus and Domino. And this is copied directly above an answering Deo Gratias response prosula. Same melody again with different text, a new text sandwiched between Deo and Gratias. And then at the bottom, the repetition of the same melody is enacted in a melismatic Benedicamus Domino chant, presented alongside its corresponding Deo Gratias response. Now, Flori Orto was known already in both northern France and southern Germany in the 11th century, and it continued to be copied in these regions well into the 13th century. I've got nearly 30 different sources of Flori Orto, and not a single one is in Aquitanian notation. And it seems instead that Aquitaine had its own alternative prosulae for this same Flos Filius Benedicamus chant, and there's one Aquitanian example we know that was inscribed before 1100. And this Flos Filius Eius prosula was added, probably in Carcassonne, to a 9th century book. Its text doesn't make any reference to the source of the Flos Filius Eius melody in the Stirps Jesse responsory, but I'm struck by the fact that its layout matches exactly the format of the southern German witness. So the elaborated versicle, Benedicamus, is vertically aligned above the corresponding Deo Gratias, and then underneath which we have the same melody written out as a melismatic Benedicamus Domino with an answering Deo Gratias. So the two prosulae offer different texts for the same Benedicamus melody, and I wondered if these isolated and disparate 11th century traces from Aquitaine and southern Germany might be indicative of what was a wider or more established early written practice, which I haven't found in any later sources, where you present your Benedicamus prosula alongside its parent plain chant. So these circumstances serve as a useful reminder, of course, that many 11th century records must be lost, and there's surely some that we've still to find. But the surviving evidence, although necessarily partial, and of course I know focused on a very small repertory and corpus, it still supports some general conclusions that apply to the Benedicamus. So we have the impression of a somewhat self-contained, local Aquitanian tradition that tended only to travel southwards. By contrast, the early Benedicamus elaborations in northern French sources are much more widely attested overall, and they also quickly travelled east. And perhaps, as Alt believed, these pieces originated in northern France, but perhaps also they are simply more representative of the kinds of music and texts that were sung quite widely throughout Europe, but which weren't typically included in Aquitanian collections, as we saw in the case of Ea Puri Jubilo. They knew it around 1100 and then they never wrote it down again. So records of Benedicamus elaborations before 1100 confirm the use of the versicle in both the office and the Mass. And the presence of Benedicamus elaborations alongside plain chant melodies for the versicle, as here, suggests the kind of functional interchangeability of these items. You could either sing the chant or you could sing an elaboration. And finally, 3 of my early Benedicamus elaborations refer specifically to their performance by boys, puri. So in addition to Ea Puri Jubilo and Ea Nunc Puri, there's a unique and lone Benedicamus item inscribed in the late 1000s on an end leaf in Worcester, which urges the boys to render thanks to God throughout all ages. So in 11th century England, just as in northern France and Aquitaine, it seems that not only was the Benedicamus sung by boys, but that its joyful elaborations explicitly invoked the youth of its singers. And this embodies an exuberant spirit of early Benedicamus elaborations, which scribes were motivated to notate on spare pieces of parchment as a site of creativity that continued for centuries. Thank you very much.
So as the person running this session, I'm going to take the privilege of asking the first question. Catherine, it's such a mountain of evidence, it's fantastic. But I keep thinking, well, where did it come from? What's going on here? And of course, the boys is one of the interesting clues, but what thoughts do you have about it?
Well, I suppose what I've tried to do is resist the hypothesis that has sort of ossified into fact in the field, which is Wolfart's view that this is definitely a northern French tradition. Yeah, I mean, there is evidence for that. I mean, Arlt's main reason for presuming that is these Anchin fragments. But then he didn't know that Floriorto, for example, was already in Germany in the 11th century. And this is something that I didn't touch on, but there's also a kind of difference in register in a way. So you saw it with Benedicamus Domino qui parvis in Presepio. The stuff that we have in Anchin is kind of a bit simpler and maybe more popular. So, I mean, look, I think if there is a theory, probably northern France is the most likely point of origin. But what I would also say is, could it not be that this is a tradition that's just being sung really quite widely, and then the written record that we have from Anchin is the first one, if you see what I mean, and that it's sort of being sung everywhere. And that relates to my work on the Stimmtausch hymn, which, again, the more you look for the sources, the more you see it's absolutely everywhere. And it's completely nonsensical to talk about origins because it's obviously something that was in the air for a long time before it was written down at all.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't say clearly I'm interested liturgically. What did it come out of? So do you put it with, as it were, tropes and sequences and prosody and so on?
Yes. I mean, yes. So the Aquitanian sources that we have are basically all tropers or troper prosers. And then goodness knows what these ancient fragments, what they came from. I would be really interested to know, because in addition to, so they're mostly Benedicamus, but there are also some Alleluias. And what size was the book? Do you know, was it one of those very tall, thin books?
If we can work that out.
Okay, yeah. So you can see one here. So like what would this have been? It's a collection of kind of simple trope songs for Christmas with some other stuff?
Collections of Alleluias in Cantor's books.
Okay, the thing is it isn't really a collection, we just have one, and then it's in the middle of lots of Benedicamus. Yeah, okay. So I think it relates to the fact that the Benedicamus is something people are singing, but they don't have a place to write it down yet. And then it gets put on the margins or integrated into other collections in a slightly random way. But it's obviously music that they care about, because they really, really want to write it down, which tells me, I think, that they are singing it. Yeah.
I want to pick out two of your manuscripts, because they have both a basic, common basic text, which is the Aiken rule for canons. So the Aiken rule of canons.
Yes, that's right. My Carcassonne one and my Berlin.
Carcassonne,
Yeah.
Paris, 15th, 30th,
Yeah.
4. And
Yeah.
the other one is the
Berlin, Ham
Hamilton
31.
31.
Yeah.
And my question is, because both are imported manuscripts. The Carcassonne manuscript is a very famous one, so I had to read Bishop again. Bishop published in 1981 a famous article on the rule of Saint Benedict in Bayern. But he is also touching this manuscript because, according to his opinion, it is a product of famous Benedict of Agnane in Aachen, from the Aachen monastery. And I'm convinced Pius Engelbert said, no. Later, Pius Engelbert said, no, this cannot be. But Bishop already found the hand in the famous collection of the rules of Benedict of Agnane in Munich. It's the same hand. So we have here a product from Aachen, brought to Septimania. Nobody ever knows if it was really at Carcassonne, because what was Carcassonne Cathedral?
Well, it was there by the 12th century, Bishop
but
says.
this is
I
a
know.
living manuscript. Yeah. They even restored it in the 11th century. And so my question is now, also combining with the Hamilton manuscript, which is also an important manuscript. It's not a product of Albi. I was with Rob Means last year and saw all the Carolingian stuff there. We had it all on our desk. Yeah, no, but let me formulate a question. Where is the place of this? It's not only the empty space on the parchment and so, because my question is, when you have such manuscripts of everyday use in these non-reformed or regulated communities, because these were the old-style Carolingian communities at the cathedrals. Exactly, this is another place at the end of the capitulatio of the Aachen rule here. Okay, but where is perhaps the common liturgical place for this piece you were now showing us in this? Because this manuscript is an import from Bourges, because Albi, so south it lies, is paleographically related to Bourges, and Bourges is central France. It's far, far away. This is the Archbishopric of Bourges is the largest one in France. It's covering all the central massif, and so going down just in front in the doors of Toulouse with Albi. And and Rob and me, we ask us, because we compare the hands of all the manuscripts to understand what the cathedral library at the second half of the 9th century is, and looking for canon law texts, and so to understand the manuscript, how they work, and how they were introduced. And now I see that there are two manuscripts with the same basic text in the south.
Yeah.
Different traditions as far as I see now, so from the organization of the text, but what is the meaning of this liturgical text?
Yeah. So, I mean, I should say that I think the Councils of Aachen is a very widely copied text in the 9th century, isn't it? Yeah, David, thank you. So, in a way, it's not that surprising. So, I have examples, you know, where there are Benedicamus twice in books of Isidore or whatever. But at the same time, you know, this book clearly was in a region where they're writing an Aquitanian notation in the 12th century, and they have this lovely bit of space underneath the Capitularium. And the interesting thing is that this Benedicamus is following two invitatory antiphons, and this first one is also using this metaphor of the bishop of David as bishop, and then my Benedicamus is also addressing a bishop. So I wonder if that's why they, and similarly the invitatory antiphons, correct me Susan, but that's also something that you could put anywhere in a book. It doesn't have such a fixed space either. Okay, so they have their own place.
But the point for you is that invitatory antiphons can be, you know, you can have new invitatory antiphons, and they clearly thought that was an interesting thing to do.
Yeah, oh, sorry. Yeah, and these ones I haven't been able to find anywhere else. I should also say I've just paid to have this Berlin manuscript digitized, so that people can see that they mended the bottom of the parchment with another 12th century music manuscript in Aquitanian notation. So they cared about music. They used the music manuscript for the patching. So this was someone who had the book probably in the early 12th century, who was probably a musician. And he had quite a beautifully written Aquitanian music manuscript that he cut up to mend it. Carcassonne, I don't know. I mean, the only musical item in that manuscript is my Flos Filius Prosula. And in fact, as you could maybe see from the image, someone erased it. So why, I don't know either. But basically, you know, you can't hardly read it anymore. They obviously tried to efface it.
Is the digitization of that available as well?
From the BNF?
Yes, I think so, because I asked Charlotte.
Okay. Well, I was going to pay for it. So if it doesn't exist, the project will pay for it. Oh, brilliant. Okay. Well, this is just my photo because it's so hard to see the... Yeah.
Thank you very much, Catherine. My first comment is perhaps is more impressionistic, which is those two vertical stripes. They reminded me, I mean, as we know from Notker, the first time his sequences circulated in St. Gall was on rotula, on parchment scrolls. So I do wonder if this is new repertory being circulated in a parchment scroll. Again, it's impressionistic, it's speculative, but it's something that one should consider. I always kind of try to say a word or two in favor of rotuli, because I think it's something that was really very much used even later on in the Middle Ages, and we kind of neglect them. But anyway, the other thing is obviously that your paper fits perfectly the conference subject and theme, because of course transmission and movement is exactly what we're dealing with. And for example, I never thought that some northern French repertory would move east. I mean, I probably did think about it in the past, but I never kind of thought about it in depth. And also the fact that the Aquitanian repertory instead would move south more easily than east or north, in fact. So I thank you for that. The last comment is, you said, so it's Apt 17, I think. The first Benedicamus on the verso of the opening, so on the top left. Da 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 da. Yeah. It may be completely, wrong, but could it be a concordance for the other Benedicamus in the other? I'm sure you've looked into it, so it's probably silly of me to ask, but your other Benedicamus source that you said I couldn't relate it to any liturgical.
8-7?
Yeah, that's probably that one.
Deo Vero?
Yeah. The one that was found by who?
This one? Okay, thank you. Let's have a look.
Again, I'm sure you've looked into it, and it might be completely.
Sorry. Why?
But it's just word for the sake of the discussion to just.
Here, sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. This one?
Yeah,
I see.
because of course, okay.
It's a bit more complicated. Let me show you
Okay,
Albi,
I'm
because
sorry, I
that's
just
easier to
couldn't see it
read.
in the picture.
Yeah. Well, I tried, but I mean, listen, that doesn't mean that it's not. So here it is here. I don't think
I
it's...
see, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. It's so tricky because, yeah. It's very tempting to propose plain chant sources all the time.
Sorry, Catherine, we've got to stop. Thank you so much for a lovely paper. So our next speaker is going to take us back to Italy. And, well, this is one of the small number of people in the world that really work on both polyphony and monophony, which always impresses me. So having started off in Oregon, I think, yeah, Emily did a PhD in Yale on 14th century polyphony. And now, I'm delighted to say, is working on Italian chant, on an Italian chant manuscript. So thank you, Emily.
Thank you, Susan, and team. This has been a really wonderful conference. New Haven 1096, now preserved in Yale's Beinecke Library, is a little studied mid-12th century notated liturgical manuscript of high quality. It was completed in a well-organized scriptorium, and later corrections and additions indicate that the book was used by its community for several generations. The manuscript contains 3 primary codicological units, which were likely bound together at a relatively early stage. The main body of the book, its second codicological unit, is a complete gradual with combined sanctorale and temporale, notated by at least 2 primary scribes. A clear change in hand and script between gatherings, but mid-chant, confirms that its scribes had access to well-organized written exemplars. Despite the change in pen, hand, and certain scribal habits, scribes clearly worked within the same house style. The other 2 codicological units bound with the gradual contain tropes, sequences, and other material, including Benedicamus melodies, a vocal exercise, and a litany of the saints. I link all 3 units to the Cathedral of San Zeno of Pistoia. The organization and contents of the gradual are very similar to 2 12th century graduals that remain at the cathedral today, Pistoia 119 and 120, and the 2 appended gatherings of New Haven 1096 have considerable overlap with the Troper Pistoia 121. Further, similar patterns of scribal collaboration can be observed in the Pistoiese chant books, and Stefano Zamponi has shown that such collaborative working is characteristic of San Zeno's scriptorium in the 12th century. New Haven 1096 expands the number of known chant books from medieval Pistoia. Although slightly beyond the chronological scope of this conference, this source offers very early examples of certain notations in Italy. Accretions to the manuscript are among its most interesting parts. Notations added to blank parchment preserve traces of ad hoc music making and music learning. Scribes recorded music for several items that fall outside of the book's formal bounds, some of which you see on this folio, like music for the Benedicamus Domino versicle, Iube Domine blessing, and lections. In this paper, I focused on 2 such additions in contrasting styles of notation, considering what they might reveal about the context in which they were created. First, I will examine a vocal exercise with an angular and boxy notation. I will then spend the bulk of my paper presenting a set of melismatic marginal additions in a cursive notation, which I will argue form 2 sets of early Italian polyphony. Together, these written traces offer new insight into musical practices for which we have no formal record and attest to the highly cultivated musical training at San Zeno's Scola in the 12th century. This vocal exercise was added partway through the final gathering in an ink that is different from that which precedes and follows it. From a second to a fifth, the exercise moves through all the ways a given interval might be filled in with a combination of semitones, tones, and thirds before moving to the next largest interval. Surviving evidence for medieval vocal exercises is unsurprisingly scarce. This was presumably a predominantly oral practice, and liturgical melodies themselves played a large role in musical instruction. Vocal exercises, such as those considered by Michel Huglot and Anne Bagnell Yardley from the 13th through 15th centuries and in English and German contexts, tend to be tied closely to the Guidonian hexachordal teachings. These exercises explicitly focus on the differences between hard and soft B and/or appear in books alongside these theoretical teachings. The exercise in New Haven 1096 is not oriented around the hexachord or rules of major and minor seconds, but I posit it is still tied to written music theory. The exercise explores the authentic D mode, with the fifth and octave as its anchor points. The content of the exercise expresses various constitutiones, or arrangements of intervals, as recorded in Guido's brief verse treatise, the Regulae Rhythmicae. In copies of Guido's treatise, these arrangements are typically communicated in a large and rather cumbersome table, here transcribed by Joseph Smits van Weisberge. The Summa Musicae Artis, a practical 12th century treatise with teachings derived from Guido and Odo, contains a section based on Guido's Constitutiones exercise. This Summa is extant in only two sources, a Lucchese codex from the 3rd quarter of the 12th century and a compendium from Piacenza in the end of the 12th or beginning of the 13th century. In both manuscripts, scribes translate the table into staff notation using angular boxy scripts which emphasize the interval content of the exercise. The vocal exercise in New Haven 1096 is clearly related to these Guidonian exercises, and this may even be reflected in its notation. I have not yet been able to identify the scribe with certainty, and firm scribal identification may prove to be impossible given the brevity of the example. In the absence of such confirmation, I will just observe that the angular aspect of the notation stands out within the entirety of the codex. This is especially apparent in some of the descending 3- and 4-note neumes, which appear to stack clavis. I propose that the Pistoiese vocal exercise shows how the Schola at Pistoia may have applied Guidonian interval exercises within their specific pedagogical context. First, it does not simply copy Guido's exercise through a fifth, but rounds it out by ascending and descending the octave. Second, the Pistoiese vocal exercise fits the line with simple and regular poetry, and this stands out within the context of similar notated vocal exercises, which are either untexted or set to a vowel. This Latin verse adds a layer of artifice, and unlike other didactic verses, it makes no reference to the interval content of the exercise. The verse may reflect the Latin training we know took place at the cathedral Schola. Finally, the notation of the vocal exercise has strong visual parallels with the musical example in the Lucchese Summa. Given the close geographical and temporal relationships between the final gathering of New Haven 1096, which was gradually added to and so might be slightly later than the main body of the codex, and the Lucca manuscript, it's possible that the scribe was familiar with this treatise and was perhaps even making reference to it through their notation. This Pistoiese vocal exercise offers a unique practical example of applied Guidonian teachings at the cathedral Schola and is a witness to an environment that prized musical training. Like the vocal exercise, a series of melismatic marginal additions at the end of the gradual attest to the high degree of musical training cultivated at San Zeno. I've labeled this series of melodies A through E. Melodies A and B were written by one scribe, while C and D were written by another. The final melody I won't talk about today, but it is similar in notation and length to C and D, and may have been written by the same scribe. These melodies are notated in a highly legated script that Giovanni Varelli has termed cursive square notation, in which he finds in other Italian sources from the 12th to 14th centuries. Melodies A and C have highly abbreviated texts underlying their whole melodies, while B has only the first 2 letters of a text, and D has a lone I, likely standing for item, that is, in the same way. These texts belong to the first verse of the Lamentations of Jeremiah, and I thank Giovanni for identifying them for me. Intoned during Holy Week, the Lamentations were furnished with a variety of melodies until the mid-16th century, when simple melodic formulae were standardized for them following the Council of Trent. The source situation for medieval lamentations is complicated because music for the lections seems not typically to have been written down at all. Their earliest melodies survive as additions to non-musical sources like Bibles and lectionaries, as in this early 12th century Bible fragment also from San Zeno. There is at present no catalog of medieval lamentations, so the scope of the corpus is unknown, although Bruno Stäblein once estimated there may be between 150 and 200 different melodies. Requiring several verses to be declaimed over the course of multiple days, the Lamentations offered fertile ground for creative musical expression. And as texts delivered during Holy Week, they were treated with a high degree of solemnity and were therefore prime candidates for musical elaboration. While some appear to be little more than simple reciting tones that resemble the later standardized intonation formulae, such as these 13th century Italian sources, others suggest a more flexible and embellished tradition. For example, this 13th century Central Italian melody moves toward a more virtuosic line while retaining the structure of a reciting tone. Partial melodies for the Lamentations added to the margins of sources in Bologna and Lucca offer traces of more ornate melodic traditions that move away from the reciting tone entirely. Their status in the margins of manuscripts may reflect a practice that was largely extemporized. The melodies in New Haven 1096 retain some structural features of simpler intonations, but they have been elevated with highly ornamental melismas, and I will argue they come together to form two sets of elaborate organa. Scholars have long acknowledged that practices of polyphonic singing thrived in medieval Italian cities to a much greater extent than the written evidence suggests. We even know that medieval singers at San Zeno sang at times in polyphony, despite the apparent lack of practical notations. In 1995, Giulio Cattin showed that 13th century ordinals from Pistoia and Padua described polyphonic practices using vocabulary that had not been recognized as such until that point, adding to similar evidence found in Siena and Lucca. Further, these lamentation settings would not be the first instance of polyphony added to New Haven 1096. At the end of the first gathering of Easter tropes, a new scribe had entered an Agnus Dei and a Benedicamus trope. Catherine Bradley has identified this trope as the earliest known example of quinos fecit, whose two melodic phrases, one ascending the octave, the other descending, can be combined to sound in contrary motion polyphony, a technique called voice exchange or Stimmtausch. The piece is here notated as a melody in successive notation. Written twice in full, the melody's polyphonic potential was clarified by a later scribe who, in a lighter ink, completed the repetition of the melody, duplicating the text at the end of the line. I propose that melodies A through D comprise two additional sets of two-part polyphony, notated in a subset of successive notation where voices do not follow each other continuously, but where each part is written on a new line with little effort made to align parts vertically. Neither set of melodies can be matched straightforwardly neum to neum or note against note, and in both cases, the first melody of the proposed polyphonic pair is longer than the second. The scribes followed dry point lines, but they did not write clefs. Therefore, in order to propose hypothetical transcriptions, I have made several editorial decisions at the level of both pitch and duration. At some moments, like the syllabic recitations, it is easy to see how independent voices might align. In more melismatic parts, where voices do not share the same number of neumes or notes, my reconstructions have required more educated guesswork. The second set of melodies is shorter and simpler than the first, and they have more potential for neum against neum alignment. I hypothesize that melody C came from a pre-existing chant, and indeed, it closely resembles a monophonic lamentation setting that appears in a 14th century manuscript from Prague. Melody D embellishes the chant as an organal voice. I've chosen to set them together starting in unison, a probable starting point for 12th century organum. In this setting, the voices move primarily in parallel fifths, and there are several moments where they come together in fifths and unisons. Reciting tones also move in fifths, the same interval used in the decidedly simpler lections from 13th century Ivrea. But in the setting from New Haven 1096, there are also a handful of seconds, and the final sonority is a third. Although this is not impossible in early Italian polyphony, the final third is perhaps less expected than a unison, octave, or fifth. The trickiest section to work out is around the word populo, where the first melody has many more notes than the second. As you see here, I can imagine a handful of plausible alignments. Melodies A and B are considerably longer and more ornate. Melody B's expansive range and the unusual way it moves through its ambitus suggests that it was not to be sung as a standalone melody. A striking, but not unheard of feature of both melodies A and B is their use of two different reciting tone pitches. This is especially clear in Melody B, where both reciting tone moments are contained within a single line of copying and thus recorded on the same horizontal plane. Given the expansive range of Melody B, I find it would make sense for this voice to start above Melody A. A hypothetical transcription starting a fifth apart allows voices to end in unison and creates lots of consonances at key moments, like the beginning and ends of words. There are few unexpected dissonances, and none appear in key places. Melodies A and B produce a very different style of counterpoint than C and D. Several features of this first set of polyphony gesture towards its roots as a piece of organum created in a structured improvisatory context. Neither melody has a strong modal profile. Instead, both appear to string together certain patterns of motion, which are highly interdependent. Voices move in blocks of parallel and contrary motion, with a few moments where one voice fits several pitches against held notes. These contrapuntal procedures are applied in a relatively consistent manner, typically within neume groupings. For example, the aleph melisma favors contrary motion, and this is especially evident in neumes that contain both ascending and descending motion. Following the reciting tones, voices move primarily in parallel motion. Further, I find two examples of the same melodic formulae set against one another close to the beginning and end of the verse. In both voices, specific neume shames repeat, setting the same melodic figuration and neume grouping in melody A against a complementary one in melody B, labeled here as block X and X prime. The pitches of these neume groupings are not the same upon their repetition, nor is their interval content maintained exactly. Such flexible formulae could have been placed together at various intervallic combinations. This pattern of neume repetition in both voices is highly suggestive of their complementary contrapuntal construction and conception. These polyphonic settings surely belonged primarily to a sounding rather than written tradition. The reconstructions I've presented today are but one possible interpretation, which is necessarily speculative due to the nature of the original notation. Modern transcriptions, even hypothetical reconstructions, fix the melodies in misleading ways. By contrast, the original notation is at once flexible and opaque, at least from a modern perspective. The highly ligated notation may have been ideal for working out musical ideas. This affordance of cursive square notation is even clearer in another marginal addition in the same manuscript, where a scribe seems to rework a florid melody for the text of Psalm 109. Despite the informality of the script, the recurrence of distinct compound neumes indicates large-scale repetition. I'd be happy to talk more about this example in the Q&A. If the lamentation setting is an exercise in constructing polyphony jotted down by solitary singers, it nevertheless offers insight into the techniques and formulae musicians at the cathedral employed to sing in polyphony. And indeed, if these added notations do form two sets of polyphony, they are significant in two respects. First, they would be very early polyphonic lections, joining examples from Aquitaine and Ivrea in the earliest polyphonic settings of the Lamentations of Jeremiah. For a long time, the oldest polyphonic setting was thought to be Johannes de Quadras' two-voice version from the 15th century, which circulated in Venice as well as Tuscany. Catine identified two earlier polyphonic versions from northern Italy, including a partial two-voice setting in a 13th century manuscript from the Veneto, and Susan Rankin located another possible two-voice version from Bologna, added to blank parchment in the late 12th or early 13th century. Clearly, in central and northern Italy, there was a long history of singing the Lamentations of Jeremiah in two voices, and these examples from Pistoia shed new light on this tradition. Second, these settings would contribute to the small corpus of practical examples of early Italian polyphony. In 2002, Rankin identified just 13 manuscripts containing polyphony from Italy before 1300. She found that these cases were recorded in an ad hoc manner. Voices could be written successively or vertically, but without vertical alignment, sometimes with guiding lines. Some pieces have radically abbreviated texts, like this hymn from Verona or the just mentioned Lamentations from Bologna. Their styles are wide-ranging. The the contrapuntal logic may be obvious in some cases, where voices move together, sharing many perfect consonances, but obscure in others, where voices move rather independently and are more melismatic. In fact, some pieces are difficult, if not impossible, to transcribe. The marginal editions in New Haven 1096, with their layout, cursive square notation, and abbreviated texts, share many unusual notational characteristics with other examples classified as early Italian polyphony, and both can be situated within the wide stylistic range of early Italian counterpoint. Given the small corpus of practical examples, each new edition is significant. Accretions to New Haven 1096 attest to the music making and music learning at the Cathedral of San Zeno of Pistoia in the 12th century. The vocal exercise and lamentation settings I have presented today lay outside the formal bounds of the codex in notations that differ from the neat central Italian notation elsewhere in the book. The range of notational styles is not inconsequential, but rather it maps a musical culture in which theory, pedagogy, and performance intersect. These musical editions productively raise questions about how scribes engaged with writing as a tool, and their notations provide crucial information that help us situate them within broader networks of musical practice. Thank you.
I think I'm going to ask the questions this time. I invite questions, Jan.
No, that's a great question. I would love to work with singers and do this, but I've not.
This seems like an awesome case for practice-based research.
It does, yeah.
To find how they feel about reading this, what they would need to know ahead of time to be able to do it. Like, this, I would be super excited actually to try and sing that with someone.
That's what I thought for the Bologna fragment, the one that I published in that article. You know very well. You know, I think this is a perfect case for research-based practice. Sorry, practice-based research, and really very much because these melodies, if just sung without any, just sung directly from a score, are just very boring. Essentially, they're not particularly interesting. I mean, at least the ones that I transcribed from the Bologna manuscript. But I think if a lot of work is being put in trying to reconstruct the vocal practice with experienced singers in that repertory, I think we could discover many more things that are not evident from looking at the notation and the transcription alone. So I think there's a whole layer. I mean, these are pieces of music really that have been composed for a particular, environment and a particular church and so on. I don't know much about, because I think we are just starting to scratch the surface now about the transmission of this repertory. Was it a particularly localized repertory, or particular belonging to particular institutions, or it was much more spread? That's probably a good question, actually, for you now, if you've got any thought about it. And then I just wanted to, congratulate you on trying to do this, because nobody has ever attempted to actually make this transcriptions, and we may be in front of a lost repertory or lost performance practice that instead is incredibly fascinating.
Question for you. When you say repertory, do you mean lamentations or polyphony or polyphony? Yeah. So as far the few examples that I know of, which as you know are not many, are totally each are unique. I have not found concordances of things, and how they're notated are different. But I do think that there is a lot more out there, that because these are written in blank parchment and margins, and often are in this notation that is pretty easy to dismiss because it looks informal and hasty. So I've done some brief now archival research in Pistoia and Lucca, and think I've found other cases that are polyphony as well. So I anticipate there are I don't know by how much the corpus would expand, but I anticipate there are more examples.
Thank you very much, Emily, for this fantastic paper. I was wondering about the bottom voice of the polyphony. I'm not sure whether I missed something, but it seems to be very high. It starts on a top G in your transcription and goes down more than an octave, so it's, you know, an interval of a 12th.
Yeah, it's really wild, and this one is the one that is, like, at least the relative pitches are the most secure because we have acoustos, so, like, they were very clear that that is the range, and it's absurdly large.
So I'm fascinated what you think, or what type of would have sung this. Is this a virtuosic performer? And if so, how would that relate to Catin's conceptions of secundare?
Yeah, I think that, like, certainly these are examples of virtuosic performers, and as far as relating to secundare and doubling, I think these are examples of that. I don't know if you have more behind the question. I think it also, even the later examples of Italian polyphony that are also often relegated as simple polyphony and it's out of fashion now, but I think these are so much more complex and intricate than what we might think of when we think of two-voice polyphony.
That's why I love the fact that you also bring in the vocal exercise, which would of course be a way of developing some form of virtuosity, especially, you know, doing the thirds up and down. That's fascinating.
This broader question. I remembered and rechecked that a part of Good Friday liturgy has specific instructions for two cantors in the litanies, and I think in some places around the Pueri Hebreorum, this is also, I'm not sure 100% what of this applies to the Middle Ages, but is there this kind of instructions connected at some point also to the Lamentations?
Directly in the ordinals that Catin has written about. So I don't have direct evidence of that. But I would be curious to follow up on your... Yeah.
Thank you. Could you share with us the first text, first slide? Yeah, the vocal exercise. Yeah, this one, thank you. The text is very interesting, and just a very general comment for everyone. Do you think that could be relations between the text, the meaning of the text, the intervals, and theological interpretation of the old? So Deus Pater, so Deus, we have the first interval, the second. So then we have Christ, and that we have the Sacrum Flamen Utriusque, the Holy Spirit that unite together. And so then, starting from Deus, that is the Father, the beginning, the first interval. Then we have all the intervals. Do you think that could make a sense, or just speculation? It is for you first, but for everyone.
I had not thought of that. That's a very, very interesting idea to think about further.
It's a fantastic idea, and it makes lots of sense. I mean, you don't have to do it in any kind of ritualistic way. It's just a very, you know, you start from this and you develop it out, and that's a clever way of doing it. I like the idea very much. And so I'm going to take the privilege of asking the last question because it's lunchtime. But I'm glad we came to this vocal exercise because it reminded me of something that Giovanni proposed yesterday. Because as far as I can see, this is not actually... Is it actually written on the lines? Because the point is that whenever I first saw this when you first showed it to me, I thought, well, I've never seen that kind of notation before. But what it actually does in these kind of the way the squareness, going very straight, is it writes something like diastematically without needing lines. So it's exactly what Giovanni suggested, the idea of diastematic notation without lines, because somebody had seen diastematic notation. And that makes sense for a vocal exercise because you need to know what the intervals are.
Yeah, I think that it's actually a bit clearer to see the lines in person in the manuscript, and they do work pretty well with the lines, but I do think that the squareness certainly emphasizes the intervals.